Welcome to Allies, a series of interviews with international experts where they talk about how their countries have changed since the invasion of Ukraine. Today with us we have the director at the Center for Security and Strategic Research at the National Defence Academy of Latvia, Toms Rostoks. Welcome, first of all.
Nice to be here.
Latvia is sort of a Baltic middle brother, if I can call it so, both sandwiched between Lithuania and Estonia in the middle in terms of economic size and also in terms of population size. It's undoubtedly a key NATO ally in the region as Riga connects the road from Vilnius to Tallinn and faces the same less and less hypothetical threat from Russia and Belarus, if anyone still considers it to have any agency over its internal affairs anymore. Still, as a Ukrainian, I know critically little about Latvia. In the past few years prior to the invasion, the country was mainly mentioned in the context of advocating Ukraine on the EU level, as well as popping up in some cultural initiatives that I saw on the media. Therefore, all too surprising for me was to see it react so zealously to the invasion of Ukraine, showing solidarity and sending aid in proportion well beyond what was expected, and that many much bigger friendly countries are yet to match. So my first question to you, Toms, is how did the public react to the invasion of Ukraine? Why was it so disproportionate?
Well, the public reaction was such that first of all, a military conflict was to be expected. After all, there was a reason behind amassing those almost 200,000 troops alongside Ukraine's borders. But we didn't know several things. We didn't know whether that force will be used in its entirety, or it will be a partial military operation where some parts of the force would be used to pin down Ukrainian forces in various parts of Ukraine, north, south, perhaps, and the main action would happen in the east. And we didn't know that. And obviously, when the attacks started, what was somewhat shocking was that the Russian forces targeted cities, military installations across Ukraine, including Ukraine's western part. And then it became clear that this is a full-blown war and that the reality has changed for Ukraine, but the reality had also changed for a number of other countries in Central, Eastern, and Northern Europe and elsewhere as well.
Were there any big protests in Latvia in the aftermath of the invasion?
Oh yeah, sure. There were mass protests in front of Russia's embassy, and in Riga, the capital city of Latvia, Russian and Ukrainian embassies are located on the same street. So they're about 100 meters apart. And there was an outpouring of support in front of the Ukrainian embassy, and there was a mass protest, obviously, in front of the Russian embassy. But then, of course, Latvia is a multi-ethnic society, and various parts of the society reacted in different ways. Obviously, the majority was supportive of Ukraine, but then there's also a slice of population that had, let's say, fully bought into the Russian narratives, and they were either blaming United States and NATO for what was happening in Ukraine. They believed that this was Russia taking preventive steps, waging preventive war, or they would blame equally on both sides, Russia and United States. The reaction has not been uniform. But what's really important to mention in the Latvian context is that the societal reaction was very different from what it was in 2014. Because back then, major political parties and politicians representing the Russian-speaking part of the population in Latvia, they didn't want to condemn Russia. Now, Russian politicians representing Russian speakers, they have come out openly condemning Russia. Also, for the first time, there have been specific events organized by Russian speakers in Latvia condemning Russia's actions. This didn't happen before. And I think that they're trying to demonstrate that, look, the Russian-speaking community in Latvia is very, very diverse, and there's part of that community that disapproves Russia's actions.
Sizable Russian minority is quite famous, even in Ukraine, that Latvia has. We heard a lot of things that happened with it. We heard of Nils Ushakov's mayor of Riga, former mayor of Riga, who was a source of many controversies in Latvia. So it's really interesting that this really changed since the last time. Because we were expecting the Russian minority to be vocally opposed to anything Ukrainian. So yeah, it is a major change. Mm-hmm. Do you think people are getting tired from the war? Those who support, first of all?
Well, I guess that when wars start, there's an outpouring of emotions. But then eventually, life more or less gets back to the normal. And in our case, well, we're not a party to that war. So people have to think about what their kids will do during the summertime, how they will pay their bills. They worry about inflation. There's an upcoming parliamentary election in Latvia in early October, which will largely determine who will sit in the parliament, of course. So there are other news stories. But I have to say this. Ukraine never disappeared from Latvian public space, from media space. The conflict in Ukraine was always there. And again, this is different from what happened with Georgia after 2008. So the Georgian conflict and the creeping annexation that followed it up until today didn't really make it to Latvian public space. But the conflict in Ukraine was constantly there. Obviously, it wasn't always number one or even number two or number three news piece, but the conflict never went away. And I think that Latvian journalists did a very good job at keeping public attention towards interested in this conflict. But then what happened since February 24th is that, of course, initially there was outpouring of support. There were donations that were coming in. There were Ukrainian refugees arriving in Latvia, and people got involved. But then, as it very often happens, this support wears out. People get tired of, let's say, working overtime to help Ukraine. But this is also the reason why we have governments, because it is then up to governments to let's say, put in place policies that will make this support permanent. And obviously, in Latvia, there's been a lot of discussion about, for how long support will be provided to Ukrainian refugees who are in Latvia, what kind of support the Latvian families will receive for, say, hosting Ukrainian refugees in their homes. But that's kind of a process thing. Very often, these are last-minute decisions. But eventually, most of the problems get solved. But even in this context, more than 4 months into the war, the public might pay less attention because of various reasons. But the public is still very much interested in that conflict. And people understand that the outcome of that conflict will matter a lot for Latvia as well.
Are there any other reasons why public is so interested in the conflict and why for so many years they kept this interest?
First and foremost, because Russia is a party to that conflict, and obviously, being a small state, we think a lot about our security. We have our concerns. Obviously, we consider Russia as our primary adversary, the main geopolitical problem, and for that reason, we are looking at what Russia does with regard to Ukraine and seeing Russia's policies. We're trying to figure out what Russia's policies might be towards Latvia, Baltic states, and NATO more broadly. So it's largely because of Russia.
So I guess to a certain extent, the same explanation works for why Latvia supported us in the numbers it has, like as a per capita ratio to GDP, that Latvia is just second only to Estonia. It was extremely surprising because I know Estonia has been working with Ukraine for many, many years. I guess there are so many personal ties here, but then Latvia comes out basically on the same level and was mind-blowing.
Well, in retrospect, that seems to be the right policy that was pursued, and it looks like our politicians made sensible and far-sighted decisions, and so kudos to them for this. I suspect that there was a little bit of a risk, obviously, involved because the same way that we didn't really know what kind of aggression would Russia commit against Ukraine, we also were not sure how Ukraine would respond. Would people rally around their political leaders? To what extent would Ukrainian forces be ready to fight against the invaders? To what extent have Russian secret services bought their way into Ukrainian political and military decision-making structures? So there were all these questions. And we also saw what happened in August last year in Afghanistan. You know, after many years of investing in Afghanistan's military and arming it with relatively modern weapons, it all fell apart without a single shot fired. Well, there might have been shots fired, obviously, but and of course, I also understand that. Look, we know Ukraine is not Afghanistan. That's just, you know, that would be an insult to make that comparison. But we have seen this Western support ending badly before, so we didn't know what was going to happen. But I suspect that eventually it was far-sighted decisions made by our political leaders. And also, Latvia was not the only country doing that. There were so many countries that were cooperating militarily with Ukraine before. So there were Canadians, there were British, there were Americans cooperating. And also because Estonia was committing a lot of military aid, it was easier for Latvia to do the same thing. And also, we were, although we were although we provided sizable military aid, it was almost 1/3 of our annual military budget, but it was from the existing stocks. And therefore it was easier to do that. So all of these factors taken together, and I will mention another thing here. When Russia issued the ultimatum to the West in December last year, it was a series of demands. Some of those demands were about Ukraine. Other demands were about NATO's presence close to Russia's borders. So basically, Russia was asking something like that NATO would have to go back to where it was in 1997. That would leave us defenseless. And if Russia would score a very big victory in Ukraine, that would have meant a lot of trouble for us in the coming years. And we made a bet, and we're happy to see that it was a successful bet.
When it comes to sending military aid and Latvia being a small country, from point of view of an outsider, it may seem that you're giving up part of your own security guarantees in terms of military materials that you have. And Latvia, as well as Lithuania and Estonia, rely heavily on NATO. If I remember correctly, you supplement air components with NATO. You practically don't have any air force yourself, as well as navies are quite weak overall. So do you think it's justified to give up so much material to a country that is not part of NATO? Does it eat up into your own defense capacity?
Well, it does, but if Russia would score a major victory in Ukraine, that the fact that we've given some military equipment to Ukraine, that wouldn't make much difference if we were to face Russia's aggression towards our countries. And I also have to say that Latvia has, as alongside Lithuania and Estonia, well, we have supported Ukraine's, Ukraine building a closer relationship with EU and NATO. So after we joined European Union in 2004. We very much supported the policy of Eastern Partnership, which was later put in place. And obviously, there have been a lot of twists and turns along the way in Ukrainian politics, then the military conflict initiated by Russia. So a lot of things have happened, but still, we think that this was the right thing to do, and it also made geopolitical sense. Because if we were left to our own devices, even with that equipment, we wouldn't be able to offer that much resistance to Russia, and we would still have to rely on NATO's military assistance.
The Estonians have their territorial defense units, something like Ukraine has, but it was in the making for many years. Does Latvia have something like that?
Well, the militaries of the Baltic states are structured differently. For instance, Estonia has conscription. It never gave up conscription. Lithuania reintroduced conscription after Crimea was taken from Ukraine. Latvia did not. And accordingly, our militaries are structured differently. So in Latvia, we have a relatively small professional military, which would be somewhere between, 6,500, 7,000 men and women in uniforms. And then we have National Guard. And National Guard are organized according to the territorial principle. So there are four major regions in Latvia, and there are four brigades. So in total, that would be 8,000 National Guard soldiers, and they would be, in many ways, they would be the first responders because they are affiliated with a particular region, and they live nearby, so they will be able to react very quickly. In formal sense, there might be differences how forces are built up, but when we compare National Guard with Ukrainian territorial defense units, there are some similarities. And we also have that territorial principle in Latvia as well. And obviously, the professional soldiers, they are many of them are in the main military base, Ādaži, which is nearby Riga. But then also those National Guard territorial units, brigades. There are also professional soldiers there, so it's a mix. In a way. So we understand that principle of territorial defense fairly well.
Since 2014, while I studied in Lithuania, I heard a lot about NATO forward presence to give confidence to the Baltic states. Now, seeing that Russia partially at least failed in Ukraine, lost a lot of equipment, probably not gonna regain its strengths for many, many years. Hopefully. People are now pushing for forward defense to have more presence of NATO troops in Baltic countries. Could you please explain more about what it is and how Latvia comes into this play?
So NATO's presence in the Baltic states more generally, and in Latvia in particular, was very limited since we joined NATO in 2004. The Baltic air policing, because that's correct, we don't have fighter jets, but then NATO has to control what happens in the airspace of its member states. So Baltic air policing mission was agreed as part of our becoming part of NATO. Then not much changed after Russia's aggression against Georgia, but then 2014 was a real turning point, and it became possible to have more multinational military exercises in the Baltic states. Also, eventually, in 2016, NATO made this decision to have enhanced forward presence battle groups. So in Latvia, that's one battalion-sized, well, actually, it's slightly more than battalion-sized unit. It was eventually there were troops from 10 NATO member states, and the framework nation of the battle group was and still is Canada, and it was seen to be enough for the time being, because it was a measure which demonstrated deterrence through alliance solidarity. So if Russia would attack Latvia or any other Baltic state, NATO troops from multiple countries would be involved right away. And also it was deemed necessary that, well, let's say altogether there will be about 2/3 of NATO member states. They would have direct stakes in the Baltic states. So they have their troops here, and as the result, they have to pay close attention to what happens here. And then, of course, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year, Things changed a lot, and it really seems that for Russia there are almost no limits in terms of using military force. We still think that aggression against a NATO member state would be a step too far, but perhaps we think that way only because Russia hasn't done that yet. So we would have to be prepared for Russia to take this step eventually. And even before the decision, NATO's decisions in Madrid, and Madrid summit is ongoing at the moment, that battle group in Latvia, which used to be 1,500 men and women, well, it's a lot more. It's a lot bigger at this point already. There's a Danish battalion. The Canadian military presence has increased, is 3 or 4 times bigger than it used to be several years ago. And we have the Spanish troops arrived with the NASAMS system, air defense system. And the American presence is also more substantial than it used to be. And actually, U.S. military arrived in Latvia. A group of U.S. airborne troops arrived in Latvia some 4 hours after Russia attacked Ukraine. So that's very quickly. But then, of course, the idea would be that we need a more substantive NATO military presence in the Baltic states, partly because it might perform this function of deterrence much better. But also, we have looked at Russia's way of war, what it does in Ukraine. And if the plan is to trade territory for time in Latvia, it would mean dozens of villages, cities coming under Russian control, and there will be plunder, torture, rape, and death. And we don't want that. And that's the reason why we're trying to convince our NATO allies to let's say, send additional troops to the Baltic states.
So it's basically you want to expand the battalion presence to a brigade level presence.
Yes, the idea is to have a brigade-sized military presence with a possibility to reinforce that brigade very quickly.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that would be enough to prevent forest brothers again?
Well, I personally think that this would be enough. But also, I think it's part of a process for us because even if a decision would be made within NATO that a division would be sent to Latvia, housing them, finding barracks. There are no barracks to house 10, 15,000 troops. Where would they train? We would need to build additional training ranges. So there will be all sorts of difficulties related to that. Thus, we think that if there will be a brigade-sized military unit in Latvia, with a possibility to reinforce that unit, we think that will be enough.
And do you think this forward defense will actually happen? How your allies are currently evaluating this now?
Situation changes rapidly, and as I mentioned before, the NATO Madrid summit is ongoing, and let's say 10 days ago, it wasn't clear whether NATO's military presence in Latvia would be substantially increased, but it's already been increased over the past several months. But it seems that both our Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs are quite confident that that this will happen. So there will be additional NATO troops in Latvia, but actually, in this case, the problem might not be a financial or sort of related to willingness to respect Russia's interests or reluctance to provoke Russia. I think we're long past that point. But there aren't enough troops that can be sort of used for this purpose. And once they are sent to Latvia, well, that brigade, it would have to rotate. So let's say every 6 months there will be a rotation, which means that Germany or Canada or some other country would have to have twice or 3 times the number of troops to allocate troops for this purpose. And if, for example, and it means that these troops would not be available for other purposes. So it's actually a very big decision. But to have that brigade and to have a perspective of that brigade becoming, let's say, 2 brigades in several years' time, NATO member states have to do a number of things: overhaul their militaries, make them more deployable, make them heavier on the side of, tanks and armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, with all sorts of air defense systems. And that's going to take time because, well, during the Cold War, NATO member states had troops, they had munition, they had equipment, but then a lot of that was lost over the past 30 years.
I see. It's mostly a question of logistics, something that we are learning a hard way here now. I also wonder whether the performance of your partners since February 24 has brought you more confidence in the protection from your NATO allies or maybe some EU partners. Has there been any changes in this confidence that you have?
Once it became clear that Russia's war in Ukraine will become a protracted war, and that Russian military was suffering major casualties and equipment loss, immediate aggression is very, very unlikely. Obviously, we can expect all sorts of provocations. We can expect cyber attacks. Russia might orchestrate a migration crisis on our borders, but that's still kind of better than the alternative where Russia would use military force. So Russia simply would be unable to take on NATO. That would be, a step too far. But we are somewhat concerned about the medium range perspective, 3, 4, 5, 6 years and more, because Russia countries in general learn from their mistakes, and Russia probably will also learn from its mistakes in Ukraine. And to ensure that deterrence remains effective in the medium and long term, we would need greater contribution from our allies. What we have seen thus far is quite encouraging. And there have been encouraging signs ever since Joe Biden became US president. He published an article. Well, US presidential candidates, they publish foreign policy programs on the pages of academic journal Foreign Affairs. And in that article, Joe Biden described United States commitment to NATO as sacred. And it means that United States and also other allies are committed to security and territorial integrity of all NATO member states. Where we've had some concerns, there are two things. First is that NATO is very heavy on the US side and light on the European side. And that should probably change. There's been a lot of talk already in Europe about the need to become more independent in military terms. But doing that would take a lot of time. The other concern is that we had a sense that some of our allies wanted to have a certain relationship with Russia that would allow Russia to pursue very aggressive foreign policy without being punished. And in that regard, obviously, we can talk about Germany's reliance on Russian gas, also the influence of Western businesses who wanted to be present in Russian markets. And there was a lot of reluctance when they were eventually leaving. They didn't want that. And I can understand that, because according to business logic, well, profit is important, and Russia is a country of 140 something million people, so it's a significant market. So we had concerns about this, but at the present point, we don't have these concerns. It would Russia can't threaten NATO at the moment. At least that's our assessment. We might be proven wrong, but we think, we hope that we're not. And in the medium and long term, hopefully there will be a stronger and more militarily capable NATO that will be ready to face Russia.
You spoke a little bit about energy security, and I remember from a conversation with your Lithuanian colleague, they now consider that independence LNG was the best idea ever in a time when cheap Russian gas was still available. And at the same time, Germany and some other European countries have expanded their reliance on Russian gas, hoping either to go the easy route or to bring peace by having economic stake. Now they can't really give away or give up this reliance easily, and I wonder whether Latvia has any projects in energy security that would allow it to stay independent in this regard.
Yeah, well, energy is obviously one of the big issues. It's a big revenue stream for Russia, and Russia has been supplying gas and oil to European Union, including Latvia. Latvia's dependence on Russian energy has been somewhat reduced. I mean, if we look back at 1990s, then there was Russian oil transit going through Latvia, and it had certain corrupting effects on Latvian politics as well at the time. But the oil transit has been largely cut. And then the question is about Russian gas. Latvia's situation is a bit peculiar in that sense because, yes, on the one hand, we are dependent on Russian gas, but on the other hand, because of the Inčukalns gas storage facility, it's not just the gas that flows from Russia into Latvia. No, it's actually stored in Latvia. So if Russia cuts gas supplies, I mean, that's a very large gas storage facility. It serves as a hub, not just for Latvia, but also for Estonia and Lithuania. So in that sense, energy security is somewhat less of a problem for Latvia. But then, of course, when we look towards the next winter, and of course the subsequent winters, then the situation is a bit more problematic. And in that context, we are looking in Latvia at the possibility of having the liquefied natural gas supplies to build a terminal that would make us independent of Russian gas supplies. The government has not made a decision yet. There are competing projects. One of the projects is a gas storage facility in Riga. The other one is in Skulte. But in any case, to sort of build these facilities, it would take a couple of years. But we hope that until then, we'll be able to rely on supplies that would go through the liquefied natural gas terminals in either Lithuania or Estonia. But it's one of the big questions that where decisions will need to be taken in the coming month.
Recently, Lithuania has blocked goods transfer through its territory from Russia to Kaliningrad. Do you think it will contribute to the escalation in the region, or Russia just cannot do anything about that?
It might be interpreted as an escalation, but I think Lithuanians are just very precise in when it comes to implementing economic sanctions towards Russia. There's no blockade of Kaliningrad. It's just that we're talking about certain goods, not all goods, but certain goods that cannot be transported through territory of European Union member states. If Russia wants to see that as a pretext for escalations, but then it can create any pretext, any time for its domestic audiences because of the government's control over mass media. So I don't think that Russia will try to use force against Lithuania or any other EU member state. But that's of course a possibility, but this is actually also a much larger question about the viability of the strategy which the EU and NATO adopted early on in this war, and the strategy was to keep this conflict contained as much as possible. And I do understand that from Ukrainian perspective, it would have been actually sort of beneficial for this conflict to expand beyond Ukraine, and because that would mean earlier and more decisive NATO involvement. But from our perspective, the risks of military conflict between Russia and NATO are too big. because both sides have nuclear weapons. So there's that risk that we cannot dismiss lightly. But we have also seen over time that it's although we're trying to contain the conflict, it is difficult because Belarus is obviously involved. And then there are sanctions against Russia. And in the case of Lithuania, those sanctions can be really interpreted by Russia as a very hostile act. Or Russia might be simply trying to test the waters. It will issue strongly worded statements and see how France, Germany, and the US would respond to these statements. And also, obviously, we've been providing military assistance to Ukraine, so which obviously makes us part of this war as well. But at the same time, we're trying to contain it as much as possible. So it's a much bigger issue and a problem for us as well.
Prior to the invasions, the US believed that war would take place, but Western Europe didn't. What was the consensus opinion on the topic in Latvia, and why?
I think the consensus opinion was that there would be a military escalation from the Russian side, but then I don't think it was a set piece scenario by Russia, because Russia had prepared certain plans and it was doing certain things. But Ukraine has agency, and also EU and NATO were involved. So I think that consensus in Latvia was that, yes, there will be something, but we didn't really know what exactly that will be. But then in retrospect, the Russian operation, it doesn't make sense in when you look at it from strategic perspective, because Russia attempted a regime change operation, and they tried to do that very quickly, and they were kind of I suspect that they were going into Ukraine with fingers crossed that things work out for them. And things didn't work out for them. But then doing a regime change operation, at least in the short run, had they succeeded, had the regime in Kiev, had they succumbed to Russian pressure, had the president fled the country, Russia might have scored a major success in Ukraine, and we would have been in an entirely different world right now. Of course, in the long run, I suspected that the Russian occupation would be very, very problematic. I suspected that Russian forces would be killed in large numbers during the occupation, and this would become a very bloody, very protracted insurgency in Ukraine. I think that was the standard take. And then people would look at the size of the force that Russia amassed, and 200,000 troops that would occupy a country the size of Ukraine in terms of territory and in terms of the number of population. This kind of occupation wouldn't work unless they had private information that it might actually work, that they would install some sort of regime in Kiev that would be modestly accepted by some parts of Ukrainian society, and and compliant, obviously, with Kremlin's wishes. So strategically, this whole operation didn't make much sense, and I think it's because of that. People thought that, it must be something about Luhansk and Donetsk, because Vladimir Putin recognized them as independent states. But these states were not within their previous administrative borders within Ukraine. So some territorial gains would have been, Russia might attempt to increase the territory of these statelets, would-be states, right? So yeah, that's how we looked at it. But in any case, I think most analysts thought that this just doesn't make sense, because we think in terms of costs and benefits, and costs would outweigh benefits. But I suspect that from Putin's perspective, Ukraine was unfinished business. In 2014, he gained Crimea, but then in the aftermath of 2014, Ukraine moved westwards. And that was not acceptable to Russia. And knowing that the Russian president is quite obsessed about history, he didn't want to go down into history of Russia as the man who got Crimea but lost Ukraine. Guess which is more important? So obviously Ukraine is more important. So he had to do something about Ukraine because before it was too late. But of course, it seems that this this war that he initiated already took place too late for Russia to reclaim control of Ukraine.
Yep. Prior to the war, there were quite a lot of strategic signals, like mixed messages. On one hand, they were preparing infrastructure around Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts near the occupied territory, so basically seeming as they would attack at some point. But on the other hand, they were blowing up supply depots around Ukraine, as well as in Europe, in Czechia in 2014. So I sometimes wonder whether there was like a second plan that they had in mind if their 3-day war wouldn't pan out.
They probably had a plan B, and they were preparing for this plan for a long time. And they probably understood that that there might be a military conflict with Ukraine at some point in future. So they wanted to weaken Ukraine by all means, buying into decision-making structures, corrupting them, blowing up arms depots. So that's actually, I mean, if you think that you might go to war with another country, it makes perfect sense to try to weaken that country.
Recently, there were rumors, more or less, that Russia may supply nuclear weapons to Belarus or station their own nuclear weapons in Belarus. How do you think it's going to affect Baltic states and eastern flank of NATO?
Well, Belarus has been a growing problem for us. We try to manage that problem. We try to work with Belarusian authorities closely. And although we don't meet eye to eye on many issues, I think we have something in common as well. Something where our interests do coincide. We want to have less Russian influence in Belarus, and Belarusian authorities want the same thing. They, once you have a state, you don't want to give up on your state. You don't want to become somebody else's puppet state, because then your state could be easily taken away from you and you would be worse off as the result. And I think that there is some overlap of interests, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland on the one side, and then Belarus on the other side. The problem, obviously, was the stolen presidential election in 2020. Being a democracy, we had to react to that. When governments start to beat up and torture their own people and then imprison them, then we have to take a stance on that. But in the meantime, we understood that the more influence Russia has in Belarus, the more dangerous it is for us. So despite the way Lukashenko was treating his society, we still had to, try to prevent our relations deteriorating to the point where we wouldn't be able to talk. And just a reminder, I think it was it was spring last year, we were supposed to organize the World Ice Hockey Championship together with Belarus, so Riga and Minsk. Obviously, it didn't happen, and the championship took place in Riga. But knowing that Lukashenko likes sports and especially ice hockey, we wanted to have that event as a way to build bridges between the two countries. There's also a Belarusian minority that lives in Latvia. There's economic relationship between the two countries as well. So in that respect, we have tried to pursue a little bit of realpolitik towards Belarus. Regarding nuclear weapons, I think that, it would not be unprecedented historically that nuclear weapons of one country are stationed on a territory of another country. Well, NATO's nuclear sharing during the Cold War is exactly that. But also, nuclear weapons have been stationed in Kaliningrad. So whether they are in Kaliningrad or in Belarus, it doesn't make much difference for us. And in any case, we are much more worried about conventional attack against Baltic states than about a nuclear attack. So, but having said that, I still have to look at these talks about Russia sort of putting nuclear weapons in the hands of Belarus. And why is that? So I think that Belarus has been reluctant to get involved in the war in Ukraine. Belarusian authorities allowed Russia to use Belarus as a staging ground. So the attack towards Kiev, it came from Belarus. Obviously, Belarusian airspace, missile attacks against targets in Ukraine. But seeing that the war isn't going well, Russian president must have pressured Lukashenko into sending Belarusian troops into Ukraine. That must have happened. And at least they're taking the ammunition from Belarus, and that is already happening, obviously. But Lukashenko must have said in response that, look, you can attack Ukraine, and you can try to get away with it because you have nuclear weapons. No one's going to risk a nuclear war. And in response to this, Russians have probably said that, look, but we can station nuclear weapons in Belarus. How about that? That would make it possible for, I mean, if that was really your concern, that the absence of nuclear weapons in Belarus would make you susceptible to NATO reaction to your involvement in Ukraine, then there you go. You can have nuclear weapons. Obviously, they will be still under Russian control, but we can station nuclear weapons. So how about that? And now, do you still have any arguments against attacking Ukraine? So I guess there's something along these lines happening in relations between Belarus and Russia.
And do you think Belarus still has some agency in what it does? Or is it exactly the example that it doesn't want to involve itself in the war in Ukraine, also providing transport, providing territory for the attacks and so on?
I think Belarus has agency. It has less agency than a fully sovereign state, let's say, because relations between Belarus and the West have broken down, and Belarus is more dependent upon Russia. But because Russia's war in Ukraine isn't going well, Lukashenko has to think about his long-term relationship with Ukraine. And whether it's Lukashenko or somebody else in charge in Belarus, Belarus and Ukraine will still be neighbors in 10, 20, 50, and hopefully 100 years. So, and dictators, they think in the long run, democratic leaders try to survive until the next Friday. Authoritarian leaders try to survive until they die in office. And I think that Lukashenko wouldn't want to side with a political leader, the Russian president, who is actually losing the war in Ukraine. And I do think, and I do hope that Russia will lose that war either in few months' time or, in the worst case, in few years' time. If there's political turmoil in Russia as the result of this war, if Putin is replaced at some point, where would that leave Lukashenko if his troops had crossed the border? And not only Lukashenko has agency, Belarusian troops have agency. If they are given the order to move into Ukraine, then miraculous things may start to happen. Some of the troops may refuse. Some of the troops may want to replace Lukashenko, or those troops might go into Ukraine and hand over their equipment to Ukrainians, which would be a smart thing to do, or join Ukrainian forces. So there's agency on multiple levels. So I think Belarus still has some agency. Lukashenko has it, but then Belarusian military has it, and Belarusian people also have agency. So there are many potential scenarios of how this might evolve.
Thank you. That's it for my questions. So I thank you, Toms, for joining us today. It has been great.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for having me.